Trust is a double-edged sword. It's both a very powerful term and it's also a term that can mean a lot of different things to lots of different people. It's something as well that the organisation or person that seeks trust can't control. At Projects by If, we talk a lot about how to engender trustworthiness, which is how can you demonstrate that you are worth trusting and do that consistently over time.
Which products and services should we trust? How can brands earn our trust? As we enter the AI agentic era, we're going to be faced with increasing concerns about trustworthiness. Our guest was described by John Maeda in 2024 as the great mind of our time for services earning trust.
Right now, the kind of marketing messages around AI are just so exaggerated that we have got this broad trust problem with this technology, not only in terms of how it actually works, but also how we're marketing it.
This is episode 29, and we're discussing Trust is a Double-Edged Sword, how AI will transform services with Sarah Gold. We're providing you with a roadmap for increasing the trust of your products and services. In this episode, we discuss the importance of civic tech in delivering equitable services, the responsibility to focus on helping people, and human KPIs, principles for increasing trustworthiness, the risk of over-relying on and trusting services too much, and how AI agents will change our relationship with services and each other.
You have this whole fascinating idea of not just human to AI agent interactions, but then agent to agent. And what kind of access or oversight will you want when your agent is chatting with another person's agent? So I think there are these kind of really fascinating interaction questions, but also fundamental transparency ones too, which is how we can start to really understand the fundamental intent of these agents.
Sarah Gold is a digital leader with extensive experience in conceptualizing, designing, and building trustworthy, high-stakes products and services with emerging technologies across private and public sector. Currently applying this expertise to build and grow projects by If, a specialized agency that she founded in London. If helps clients, including the UK government, Virgin Media O2, and TELUS Health, grow in new markets and deepen existing relationships through greater customer trust. She advises the Mayor of London's Data for London program and the UK Design Council on digital. Her work on legibility of complex systems has won several awards, including Forbes 30 Under 30 and The Observer's New Radical. Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it will transform industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. We are on a mission to collect examples of how you're using AI to elevate your work. Share your examples at designof.ai. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. You can find it at designofai.substack.com.
I want to start with something that you have on your website. So you have a quote, "Social activists typically fight by organizing, but you can fight by inventing." How do you read this quote in a moment like this where a government is dismantling services that were invented to help others?
So the original quote comes from one of my heroes, Brett Victor, who, if your audience hasn't looked into the work of Brett Victor, I strongly recommend having a search for his lectures and his current work on what the future of interaction design might look like in the context of AI, because it's really inspiring. And the context of that quote, it was a talk that Brett Victor gave to a room full of software engineering students. And he was really talking about, I guess, working to principle. And I'm just going to expand that quote a little bit to give you a bit more context. So he was saying that the purpose of this talk is to tell you that this activist lifestyle is not just for social activists. As a technologist, you can recognize the wrong in the world. You can have a vision for what a better world could be, and you can dedicate yourself to fighting for principle. Social activists typically fight by organizing, you can fight by inventing. And that always really inspired me to really think about how the application of digital, the application of technology can be applied for good. And I guess that comes back now to the question, which is that not all change is the same. And I think the change that Brett Victor was really speaking to there was about how, as technologists, we can work against injustices, we can develop greater responsibility and morality in our work, and that's important to do. I think the change that's happening currently, particularly through the Department of Government Efficiency in the US, is not good change. And I think it's important to distinguish between them both. And because it's important to distinguish between what I would describe as a vindictive and cruel destruction of government and efforts that are much more reasonable and effective approaches to government reform that are about strengthening democracy and building better, cheaper public services. We risk kind of normalizing fascist moves, really, that are happening at the moment in the US and undermining these other more reasonable approaches elsewhere in the world. So I think it's important to note that not all change is the same. Some is good, some is bad. And I think what Brett Victor speaks so strongly about is that as technologists, we have a real responsibility to bring morals into our work, because the kind of power that digital has over all of our lives is only getting bigger and bigger. And so we have this responsibility as technologists and makers to try and shift that into a place that helps more people, rather than forming centralized moments of power that can be manipulated for harm.
Now, that is a very important and pressing point. I do want to note that I'm sure many people listening are assuming that this efficiency directive is a good thing for the government, but let's look at it pragmatically. Their gain or their intention is a balance book outcome. They want to reduce the amount of expenses on the government balance sheet. That's fair. The problem are how many services and how many people's livelihoods, both in terms of their jobs, but also the services they rely on, are undermined as a result of that balance book outcome. The point here is that not all change is good, and that change has different KPIs we need to be focused on. And some of those need to focus on the human outcomes, not just the business outcomes. And in a moment like this, where we're rushing headfirst into technology, it's sometimes hard to keep track of all the different KPIs at hand.
I think it's a really fair point. And I think the drive for greater efficiency can at times not align with actually what we want to create, which is better, cheaper public services. And I think, to your point, that focusing purely on digital as that lever, whilst digital, we know, creates cheaper services, digital is generally cheaper to run, we can't forget overall what we're actually trying to achieve. And I think sometimes, as you say, focusing on singular KPIs, we have this big human impact, which we really shouldn't ignore. There's a speed of change and that ambition, which is impressive, but we have to aim it towards the right outcomes. So I just wanted to build on what you said there.
When we look at civic technology, this is something that has really grown to be an important and critical trend, because it's a matter of digitizing public services. It's a matter of bringing more people into a realm where they can access services that perhaps they weren't aware of and they can benefit from. In that realm, the UK and the US have all had different civic tech mandates and initiatives. Many of them are in the headlines right now because of many being cut in the US. But in particular, the UK's government digital service had been, let's call it a strong case study of what digitization could look like. As we go on this thrust to automate everything, there is also this goal, underlying goal politically, to bring in austerity measures. What happens when we shift from the noughts and the teens, where it was all about bringing people online and making things equitable, to now it's, we need to make things efficient? What is that looking like in the UK and other jurisdictions where these two cantering mandates have to fight it out?
I think that drive for efficiency has, oh my goodness, been around for a long, long time. And you're right that we are living in a time where that feels more important than ever. And I think the word almost for 2025 is growth. And there's this miracle that we expect AI to perform, which is both make services more efficient and help us to grow. We've yet to really see that that happen. We'll come on to the efficiency piece with AI later. But I think there's a approach, particularly in the UK, that, as you say, we've got a long history of, which is around digital transformation, moving the state online, changing the way that people interact with the state, so that rather than interact with individual departments, we're seeing our interactions with the state as end-to-end services. And I think that where Government Digital Service successfully got us to was digitalising many of those existing services, but not necessarily thinking about the joins in between services. So to register a birth, for example, in the UK, or to start a company, you'll need to go to multiple different government departments in order to complete the thing you need to do. There is more scope now to drive more efficiency by really thinking about end-to-end journeys, being far more holistic about the way that someone accesses government services, so that we're actually being far more user-centered. We're removing this idea of Conway's law, where we ship our organizational chart, and we move to something that's far more joined up as an experience, but where we're thinking about designing and developing services in much more kind of componentized or fragmented ways. We can see some of that trend already in the private sector when we think about things like Apple's shortcuts, where you're able to perform almost micro actions outside of an individual app that help you just get the things done that you want to do in your day. And if we kind of apply that to some of the ways that we might use government services, I think there's still scope to really think about how to make better, cheaper services by thinking more holistically across services, not only kind of governmental silos. And there are some really brilliant teams, particularly in the UK, working on this. We've just recently had our UK digital blueprint announced, which came with a series of short videos that you can view online that kind of alludes to some of the ambition there of how we can actually achieve greater efficiency within services by taking a wider transformation approach. So really thinking about effectiveness as the goal, with efficiency as something that can be obtained as a result of that outcome.
So just to add on that, I think this highlights the first point we made, which is that there's balance book KPIs and then there's human-centered KPIs. And services traditionally had been delivered from the perspective of the ministries or departments that were responsible for that mandate. So like you said, you'd have to go from one department to another department to a separate department. And each of those experiences might have been developed differently with different tools and components and libraries and such. What you're proposing is that rather than slashing bureaucracy, we slash the digital bureaucracy, and that could reach the same outcomes. Is that what you're proposing?
I think it's a good way of putting it, definitely. Within the kind of civic tech community in the UK, one way that it's being discussed and is being particularly promoted by a really excellent thinker in this space, Richard Pope, is that we should have a measure of the success of government services as being the reduction of administrative burden on the public, which is an overall KPI now that's written into the blueprint, which is that we should see that reduction overall in bureaucracy for the public as a marker of success in how well we're able to transform services. And I think that speaks to the human outcome of bringing a much more end-to-end service journey into priority, as opposed to individual services where we struggle to think sometimes about the beginning and the end, or how they join up to other services. This is really a different way of thinking about our work.
One of the use cases for AI is to be that thing that joins together these disparate services, right? But when we're talking about something like government, and when we look at the levels of trust in government and how we're seeing trust in government agencies declining and trust in private industry increasing for whatever reason. So as someone whose passion is designing trustworthy interfaces and, building trust building experiences, how do you see AI being leveraged in these digital services to improve trust in government, not just trust in use of services?
Totally. Gosh, trust, it's a double-edged sword. It's both a very powerful term, and it's also a term that can mean a lot of different things to lots of different people. And of course, trust ultimately is a feeling. It's something as well that the organization or person that seeks trust can't control. So it's only something that someone else can give you. You can't just make it happen. At Projects by If, we talk a lot about how to engender trustworthiness, which is how can you demonstrate that you are worth trusting and do that consistently over time. Our thinking about the idea of trust stems from lots of different brilliant thinkers that have spoken about this in the past. One of them in particular is Elinor Ostrom. And she speaks very eloquently about how we don't want to just blindly achieve more trust, because it wouldn't be good. And I'm paraphrasing her badly now, but we wouldn't want to trust more untrustworthy organizations or things. We want greater trust in the things that are worth trusting. And so she argues for more trustworthiness. And so I think the aim of a lot of the work we do is really thinking about how we can create moments that help people make good trust decisions. And ideally, that will be because the organization is worth trusting. And we know that some of this comes from doing the basics really well, providing great services, being reliable, responding to those moments where services fail well, recovering gracefully, making sure you've got offline options for people to go to when they need it most. I think we all have those stories of when services have failed us, and it's so frustrating, and you do lose trust in those moments. So I think there are how do we get our good services in place? And there's a service designer in the UK that used to work for Government Digital Service, now runs a business called the School of Good Services. But Lou Downe has a book called Good Services, which covers some of these fundamental ideas of what services just need to get right at the beginning. But when we start to layer in more complexity, like technologies like generative AI, which are harder to understand, we are in a way adding many more like relationships and things to understand or things to trust in order to fundamentally feel like you can trust how a service works. AI brings opportunity to demonstrate trustworthiness. There's also big risks too. To speak to some of the areas that I think are opportunities for AI to help both maintain and rebuild trust with the public, there are some bog standard everyday use cases that I see some of our clients seeking but are useful, which is that particularly post-COVID, many departments have got huge paperwork backlogs. For example, from COVID, we know that the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK has a huge backlog of digital evidence that they need to sort through in order to label and manage cases through the criminal justice system. Generative AI can be applied in very specific ways to help sort some of that data. And there are other departments with similar kind of backlogs of information to go through where we can apply generative AI to help caseworkers or kind of, colleagues internally to do their work more effectively. What's interesting here is I'm noting like very specific use cases of this technology. I don't see the wider applications of, say, chat as being something that is useful enough or trustworthy enough for citizens. However, these kind of targeted cases I think are useful. And obviously the implications of that is that you're able to achieve your service outcomes faster. And we know that being able to be responsive to our user needs is one way to really engender trust. So I think there's an opportunity there. The second area I would say is there are particular like niche user needs where AI can be applied to engender more trust. A really nice example of this was when some years ago we were working with a service gave people who were in debt support. And what we learned was that many people can feel very vulnerable talking to another human about their debt situation. And they feel far less judged when they speak to a computer. And so building out not necessarily generative AI, but chat interfaces for those users to share their debt needs was a far more helpful way for them to share what they needed so that the service was able to provide support. So that's another area that I think the application of automation can really help build greater trust with an organization. And then the third area that you actually touched on, Brittany, is the ability of when we apply some of the large language model technology to our infrastructure, the ability to join services together and to have a more proactive experience of services. So when services kind of come to you rather than you needing to go to them, we've got lots of those in the private sector that we use every day, of notifications being sent to you or services happening in the background on your behalf. Some of this may or may not also be enabled by AI agents. We're really in a very nascent moment of that. But so I think there are these three areas where we can apply AI in order to really enable greater trust. And there might be more in the future, but I think this is dependent on applying quite narrow use cases rather than thinking about AI in this kind of very general purpose way, because it's too hard to apply that to really specific user needs.
Something fascinating that you've illustrated here is that we're at this junction of how we rely on AI. And there's a couple analogies at play. One is as the assistant, this autonomous assistant that can do things, that can make things easier. The other is as the oracle. The oracle intimidates me because this is when we're handing over trust. I know in civic tech, we'll never get to that point, but in the private sector, there's a lot of people pumping this idea of AI as an oracle and that it is more trustworthy than any other group in your life. But at the same time, there's tons of evidence. There was more evidence that came out this week that showed that AI agents are still presenting fabricated citations, even when they have deals in place to license that information. They're still fabricating and the citations are incorrect. What do you see coming forward when we have this idea of the AI oracle challenging institutional trust?
From previous work that I've been part of, where we've looked at this idea of AI as an oracle, which I think is a mental model that we have from also lots of Hollywood movies, but it's definitely something we hear in our user research of AI as the oracle of the knower and more trustworthy. There's so much we could unpack in this question. There are a few challenges that I have with it, which is that generally as humans, we will decide what and whom to trust if you can demonstrate a real interest in what's good for me. Psychologists call that epistemic trust, like the origins of how we form those original trust thoughts. And it's very difficult to do that with a digital technology. To some extent, a question of where we think technology should and should not be in our lives. I think, as you say, there are so many applications pushing for this sense of or idea of that AI oracle. And I think the danger with that is that when we apply very fuzzy technologies like generative AI to those kinds of interfaces, by which I mean not precision computers, but kind of fuzzy computers, where you have hallucinations or false positives, false negatives that are a feature, not a bug, we really risk encouraging people to put their trust in the wrong place. In many situations, that can lead to greater consumer harm and issues of many societal issues that we have really yet to see how we can respond to from, the social media wave, let alone now what we see in AI. So I think it's a really tricky place to be in and is driven by perhaps a set of ideas about what the future of technology should look like that is perhaps quite detached from the help and needs that people really have every day in their lives. The danger there is this gap and drive to perhaps unintentionally but mislead people, but leads to a place of much greater harm than if we were able to be more transparent about the limitations of these kinds of interfaces. And part of the challenge there as well is they're conversational. They kind of sound like us, or the way that we are presenting outputs can sometimes feel very human. So it's very easy, I think, to feel misled. And of course, one of the big areas where we're seeing most harm is fraud, particularly from conversational AI, as well as kind of fake imagery that can be created. We're seeing a huge rise there in scams or romance frauds. And these kinds of issues have a massive impact on people's trust, but also ultimately their finances and quality of life. So we have to see, some of the real world consequences of this technology to come back to the question of, should we be pursuing that as a route of how we can develop services or not? My argument would be only in very specific cases.
Let's take a step back, because I want to touch on what you're talking about now in a more specific way. Let's start with the idea of building trust in the first place. We have people from all different backgrounds. We're also seeing that people who historically have not been high tech adopters are very quickly adopting to generative AI because it's quite easy to use. It has fewer barriers than even just having to go and sort through several sources online. So there's a lot of reasons why people are moving there. So let's talk about what are some of the ways in which these different platforms are building trust with people of all these varied backgrounds. And to that point as well, I'd love to hear some specific examples from you of not just how are they building trust, but also building a sense that an experience is trustworthy. But what are some of those measures or KPIs of how we can know that it's building trust, that it's effective in that?
It's funny, isn't it? I think organizations love to talk about innovation a lot, and yet those who are actually doing it in the public are more limited. So it's always interesting when folks ask me for those examples, and I've got a few that are good. I wish I had more. So one of the examples that I like a lot is from Pinterest. They have this inclusive AI approach. So as you go onto Pinterest to kind of search for inspiration, Pinterest has increasingly also become somewhere where folks shop as well. And they realize that to be inspired, you can see images, or particularly of clothes, for example, on any body type and shape. But when you want to go and buy clothes, you actually want to see those clothes on a body that represents yours. And so they began to this tailored kind of experience enabled by an AI that helps to bring more representation to their platform, but then also helps people to be able to kind of personalize their experience. And whilst I can't quote the kind of figures and stats off the top of my head from their CEO, they have got some really nice examples of how that leads to greater user acquisition and retention in their platform through answering kind of representation needs and using AI to do that. And I think that's a really good example of how we can have more responsible uses of AI to create truly standout experiences that, because people trust it more, are more likely to use it, more likely to come back, and more likely to recommend it. Other examples of the kind of trustworthiness, I'm going to take a public sector example from the UK because we've been talking about it, is Government Digital Service. They have a UK chatbot. I think it's now in kind of a public state, but for a while they were exploring it in private beta. But this is essentially a kind of chatbot interface into gov.uk, which is the main kind of website or way in that you might access government services in the UK online. They've blogged about their research around trust, because what they realized was many of the users coming to check out the chatbot to ask questions over trusted the chatbot, partly because of the gov.uk logo. And so they added specific points in the interface to just help users question what they were seeing, but realize that what they were using would get some answers wrong. So they were intentionally adding points of friction into the interface to help people pause and apply human judgment. And that is overall there to maintain a level of trust with government services. They didn't want to intentionally or unintentionally mislead users, but also they wanted to explore what were the ways that they could be more transparent too about how that AI worked. They started then to work on these moments in the interface where you can click through and just understand what resources did the model use in order to come up with the outcome that it presented. And it's just those small moments of looking behind the hood, of showing kind of where the seams are in services, so where things join together. In this case, it was what are the kind of policy documents or rules that are being used by this model to give me this output, could help people make a trust decision in the moment about the outcome they were being given. So I think those are two really nice different examples of the application of AI that can help engender the feeling of trust through demonstrating trustworthiness to customers. And I think on the measurement piece, this return on trust is something that, we've seen in kind of trust in brand. Now this question of how do you translate that into digital services is a question that we think a lot about within my team at IF. And something that we think is more meaningful is to, rather than talk about trust at a kind of overall level for an organization, because it can mean so many different things to different people, we like to try and translate it into kind of micro moments within a journey. So where are the moments that trust could really matter to what a user does next, or what you hope that they will do, and to create measurements in that journey, in those micro moments that can help us understand whether we are achieving greater trust. So to kind of break it down into moments and make sure that those micro moments of trust are really connected to your commercial goals if you're working in the private sector, because we know that product teams are incentivized through KPIs that are about the bottom or top line. And so we really need to align these trust goals into that. Otherwise, what we tend to find is they get deprioritized. Teams just can't work on them. And so finding ways that we can make sure that they're aligning to the product incentives themselves feels like a really helpful and useful way for organizations to prioritize this.
A lot of our listeners are in the private sector. What they've told us when we've had conversations with them is we're deploying all these AI features, we're trying to help people, we're trying to simplify processes, but it requires users to give up some control. It requires them to have faith that this tool is going to do it in the right way, in a way that is as appropriate as possible for them. But nonetheless, they're still finding that users are struggling with some of these Gen AI features. Perhaps it's because they're first generation, perhaps it's for a ton of reasons. But what can these people do when they're trying to implement tools that require users to give up control as a way of getting the benefit?
Well, and give up more data than they're used to.
Yeah. I mean, what a juicy question. I think that we have this, I guess it's kind of frustrating precedent that social media gave us, which was kind of give up information about you in order to have access to a network. And if you don't, you'll have real FOMO, fear of missing out, or loss of access, or loss of like financial help. You're only going to get the discount if you're part of this network. So we have this kind of precedent that's been set there that I think has really run its course. I think more people now than ever before are really aware that information about them creates inferences that are commercially super useful, but also can be used for harm. We've seen so many data breaches and so on. So there's this kind of greater awareness around how is information actually being used. And I think that over the years, the projects we've worked on, we've distilled 3 characteristics broadly to think about when you want to really develop complex services that use data and technologies in ways that people might not think about or anticipate. And they are transparency, participation, and accountability. The transparency piece is something that I'm passionate about and really personally very interested in, which is how do we begin to progressively disclose at the point of use how a service works, why information or data about you is collected and how it's used. So not putting that stuff in terms and conditions or terms of service that very few people look at or understand. How do we start to surface what matters to people in the moments that count within the service itself. That means that people really experience the transparency. So this needs to be designed, needs to be thought about through user needs, so that you're able to understand how a decision about you, for example, was made, why that decision was made, and then who could you go to if something about that doesn't look right. So you can progressively understand how the system is working. And that transparency can also be about how data flows through a service. We have some really nice examples of that from Certificate of Transparency, which is how we're sharing this video call today. So, we know that through our URL bars that we are connecting through a legitimate server, and that's done through kind of cryptographic technologies. Browsers are incentivized to keep us safe, to make sure that our information is held safely and we're not using kind of phishing sites. And I think we can absolutely apply some of that to services today. When we look at the Apple Intelligence that was announced alongside Apple's latest AI features, that's a direct translation of some of the technologies that run Certificate of Transparency into the consumer products. So I think we'll be seeing more and more transparency about data flows that's really provable within services. The other two kind of characteristics, participation. This is about how can you make sure that you can give feedback about the services that you're using. If you think that there are particular kind of, for example, data points that are being collected about you that you deem to be unnecessary or too much, how can you give feedback on that? Participation shouldn't just be co-design at the beginning of a design process. It's how do you bring your users with you and maintain close contact with them through the kind of launch and delivery of a service. And when it comes to using these fuzzy technologies like AI, I think it's a very powerful tool to maintain in your services, because actually you need your models to be representative of all of your users. And so I think that's useful as well from a technology perspective. And then you have accountability, which is that who to contact if something goes wrong. And if something goes wrong, you have the ability to seek redress. This is something that I think far too services do well. And yet we've all been in a journey of a service that hasn't worked for us and we've needed help. And I think that, really having that as part of how you're designing services that collect more data and more novel data is super important, because we know that data about us is held incorrectly or the wrong data is held. We want to be able to correct that. So it's, it's about us, it's right. But also if we think that something doesn't look right, we need to be able to share that. An active group of users who are able to say if something doesn't look right is a really good defense against kind of misuse or kind of unintended consequences too. These have got benefits both to kind of users, but also the organization too.
Those principles all make 100% sense. I do want to highlight, though, that anytime that there's been a major transformation, there's always a resistance to change, right? The minute that we digitize services, people are assuming that we're cutting off their equitable access to in-person. Same thing when security was implemented at airports. It was presumed that it was against the public good, even though ultimately it is. When we think of things like self-driving cars, there's a lot of theoretical benefits of it, that if everyone's in a self-driving car, the throughput of a street should be better. And equally so, if you trust the bot, it should be able to do a lot of things autonomously for you. So it seems like there's always this step and resistance that go hand in hand with things. And ultimately, just like a robo-advisor it's intended to give you financial advice and set you up with a trading account and such, there's always this step of what you can gain and what you have to give up. Is that a matter of trust, or how do you characterize this trade-off that has to come with some of these major step-up types of technologies?
So I think there's a really wonderful saying that a colleague of mine, Rachel Caldicott, says, which is that, although I don't know if the original quote comes from her or not, but she certainly said it, which is that technology should certainly only move at the pace of trust. We have to keep in step with societal expectations. And there's always the outliers to that. For example, the iPhone, the original launch of that that was a product no one saw coming in a way, and definitely moved outside of, I think, perhaps societal expectations of what it meant to have so many songs in your pocket. But I think broadly, when we're talking about these kinds of technologies and the impact that we're now talking about them having in our lives, whether that be through data collected for genomics programs or ancestry uses, or data collected on your wrist about your health that can go to your doctor, we're talking about uses of technology and data that are far more impactful to us as individuals and as a society. And so I think that overall kind of friction that you're talking about the adoption piece, is helpful rather than a hindrance, in the sense of what we don't want is, and what I think we have seen with some of these large language model organizations, is this kind of move fast and break things mentality. And we can see at a broad society level where that ends up. As I said before, we still haven't really got over what's happened with social media. We're still trying to understand systemically what that is doing to society, to how we organize democracy, these, big topics. I would feel there's so many great people to listen to on that stuff. And yet we're launching this kind of new capability, but without really thinking about these guardrails. We have the opportunity, if we prioritize it, to think about innovation like within the right guardrails for society. And I don't think that's too much to ask or to aim for. We should be thinking about how we innovate within constraints. In fact, constraints make us more innovative. And so we only can drive as fast as we can on our roads because we have speed bumps, seat belts. These kinds of features within these technologies enable us to do more. And so I think, how can we use this as fuel for good innovation, the right innovation? I think part of it does fundamentally come down to trust. And I think that we are right to question some of what we are presented with. And in particular, right now, the kind of marketing messages around AI are just so exaggerated that I think we have got this broad trust problem with this technology, not only in terms of how it actually works, but also how we're marketing it. That if we don't sort out, I hope it doesn't stop us from using it for really good uses down the line. But right now, it's certainly creating this real confusion, and I think genuine direction of capital for many organizations too.
I want to circle us back to something that we started on. We were really early on talking about this idea of using AI agents to be able to almost mend the holes that exist within these different experiences. And so as we talk about this kind of agentic era where AI agents will automate workflows and interact with other agents, it's going to shift the way that we think about trust, the way that we have to design for trust. And while it is incredibly scary, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and working on projects that try to look towards the future of what is the version of this that we want to build. I think even though we're looking at a future where these agents might be working with minimal oversight, I also see this really interesting opportunity for dashboards or new kind of products that allow us to actually see more of what's happening behind the curtain. How are these agents interacting with each other? Having one master agent where we can really have much more control and allow that to act on our behalf. And so as we can kind of define a version that really does represent us, where we can say we're going to change the history or the knowledge of what it exemplifies about us in one place and allow that to act on our behalf in other places and have one source of truth. There's some really interesting opportunities for trust building and shifts in how we trust and engage with technology. What part of that kind of agentic era excites you?
So we worked on AI agents at IF for, some time. I think the first time we did a project on that kind of work was sort of 7 years ago. So well before this current hype. And I remember when we were faced with this question of how might you build and actually then maintain trust with this software that is going to learn, and it will change as it learns more about you. And what I found so fascinating then, and I still find fascinating now, is that these are going to be new kinds of relationships that we will form with computers that will need to change over time. And so the way that we design our products and interfaces should also change over time. And they should feel kind of human, I think. And that's one area that I'm really excited about, which is that when you first interact with an agent or give the agent permission to view certain things about your life, you might be asked a number of questions that, as the weeks go on and that agent performs well, it's reliable, consistent, that you might then entrust more to that agent, but also the agent's going to make inferences or observations about you that mean that those interactions might get shorter or more brief. One kind of farcical example of that we had was booking a haircut for you. Initially, it was, when would you like the haircut? With whom? What time suits you? How long would you like the appointment for? And over time, that became, based on your latest selfie, a haircut has been booked for you in 2 days' time. So there was this kind of idea that over time, and it's a silly example, but it kind of shows that over time, the way that we interact with or will expect to interact with these agents will change in the same way that our relationships with each other change, that we have these shortcuts and ways of communicating that shift. So I'm interested and excited about how we can begin to create those experiences that genuinely change over time in a very human-centered way. I think there are many of our interactions that are just really pop-up notifications. They're the same. I think this genuinely needs a new playbook of kind of interaction patterns to really work. And then you have this whole fascinating idea of not just human to AI agent interactions, but then agent to agent. And what kind of access or oversight will you want when your agent is chatting with another person's agent? So I think there are these kind of really fascinating interaction questions, but also fundamental transparency ones too, which is how we can start to really understand the fundamental intent of these agents. I remember that project that we ran 5 years ago. We were really thinking about how do agents become part of a commons rather than the market? Like, to what extent would you really entrust an agent in particular parts of your life if you knew that it had a commercial interest over a public one? And I think these kinds of issues will be things that we'll need to unpack and find out more about to really make this kind of vision fundamentally work for people. So what will we need to understand? How will we show that in the ways that we interface with these technologies? And I think you're right in that there are administrative tasks in all of our lives that computers are just really good at. We should be able to offload that whilst also maintaining what humans are really good at, so we can always have humans in the loop. And I think we need that new playbook. I don't want us to end up with more privacy settings that we have to go and find in our apps that very few of us do, to understand both how these things work, but also how we can control them. I think we need to see far more imaginative ways of this happening around us, as well as within the actual interface or application that we're using.
So if we hand control to agents, what role do government or brands have? If we think about right now, we have, for example, really deep relationships with banks or with other agencies or companies that deal with quite trust-rich parts of our lives. In the multi-agent future, we may have them work, for example, with 4 different banks at the same time. And the trust in that brand perhaps becomes irrelevant or less relevant. And we see that happen in other industries where services become commoditized to only the public-facing brand being replaced by a platform. So like car insurance, mortgages, we don't particularly know or care who we have it with, as long as it will do the work that it needs to do and it's easy to access. So for the people listening who are generally working for companies where right now brand is such a big deal, in this agent-to-agent world, where brand becomes less relevant, but trust is increasingly still important, What advice do you have for those people?
Yeah, such a rich question. The risk of disintermediation in that agent to agent environment is real. And you can already see that the idea of brand as trust is going to shift in that world, as you have described. And I think that instead, thinking about how to differentiate your service through trustworthiness will become more and more important, because those agents will be doing or performing more and more sensitive tasks for you, or having access into areas of your life that previously only you were privy to, or the customer service agent that you were speaking with. Being able to demonstrate that transparency, participation, accountability in really meaningful ways to users that they can experience. And I think that's the key part here, that it's not just a promise, it's an experience that you have tangibly through using the agent that represents the brand. That, I think, is a key differentiator for people. And we can see this now, which is that it's not about launching the biggest implementation of AI. It's actually the AI that we're able to trust, where we're seeing the most meaningful adoption across organizations. And I think that that will continue, particularly in this agent land. So the advice that I have for folks who are focused on brand is really to begin to think about, in what ways can you translate your values really into a differentiator of trustworthiness, something that you can consistently demonstrate and prove, not just words, but acts. And there are a number of different features and ways that can be expressed. It doesn't always have to be utilitarian. It can also be fun. And I think we've got some great examples of that on our catalogue. It's catalog.projectsbyif.com. It's the UK spelling, so catalogue has a U in it. And we've got some examples of design patterns for automated systems, so repeatable solutions to common problems. And with AI and trust and the kind of confidence questions we might have, you could take some of those patterns and begin applying them to some of your experiences, to just start testing the edges and really start to imagine what that experience could look and feel like for you and your brand.
A couple of months ago, I worked on a project for financial services. It was very similar to yours. It was about educating people about investing. And one thing that was very fascinating that came out of it was that younger cohorts tended to trust private sector organizations more than institutions. They'd be more likely to trust a thought leader or somebody online who seems authoritative than a brand itself. A couple months ago as well, we had a pair of people on our show. One was the father, one was the daughter. And what was fascinating about this conversation, it was the one about sentient design, is that his daughter is growing up with AI by default. She can somewhat remember what it was like before AI, but her reality is so different from us. So what I want to know, and we can only speculate at this point, is what does the future look like for someone who's 10, 15 years old right now? Because the way that we rely on Google and trust it, they're going to rely on GPT in a different way. And their children, it might just be trust by default, I'm not sure. But is there any research to show what is happening in trust from a generational perspective?
There are some brilliant pieces of research out there in terms of generational trust, but also trust differences between different communities too, which I also find absolutely fascinating. The way that we think about this segmentation matters too. There's a wide body of research. Some of the stuff that I find most interesting at the moment is coming out from a team at King's University, Sylvia Delacroix. She is looking into what is the impact of the way that the future generations will converse with one another when we have this expectation that we can talk to computers. And of course, computers are really bad at being able to understand the kind of inferences and nuances of conversation, body language, pauses, intent, context. And yet we expect them to converse with us in the way that a human would. And her research is looking at what are the implications for the future of conversation. I mean, that's mind-blowing stuff, because conversation is such a fundamental part of what it means to be human and part of a society. So that, in terms of in the context of trust and how it will change what we trust and how we trust, I think is absolutely worth looking at. You've got other pieces of research that are much more defined by their specific context of what they've been looking at. But for example, Channel 4 in the UK recently had a piece of research looking at Gen Z and trust when it comes to AI generated content and their ability to have confidence in institutions. This need for having like verifiable sources of truth and what can be done there, I think is interesting when we think about the implications of the kind of the feeds that we look at and that kind of algorithmic interfaces that we look at. So there are a number of different areas looking at how does this fundamentally change the way that we interact with the technology, what we understand from it. And I think there's so much that we just don't know yet. And so the application and need for more research, particularly academic research, is something we really need right now to understand where this could all be headed.
Well, Sarah, thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughtfulness on this critical topic. I'm wondering if there are any other people you might recommend that people read up on and look up for other guidance on this challenging topic.
Yes, I'm going to reference a few names that I've already mentioned, but I think the work of Eleanor Ostrom in her work on the commons is somewhere that I would encourage your listeners to go and research and read up on. I think her thinking was really prescient and is still super important. Brett Victor's work, if you really want to see some hopeful but also just totally inspiring thinking about the future of interfaces. I've also got this book next to me, which if you've not read, I really recommend, which is called The Real World of Technology by Ursula Franklin. I think for me, I keep coming back to this time and time again. And I think some of her thinking and application of this in the context of large language models is just so important. And I would also big up Maggie Appleton's blog. She's been writing for some time about how you practically implement and use large language model technology in ways that create genuinely useful outcomes for users. So I would recommend that. And then also our Medium blog posts at Projects by If. We irregularly but blog about our work and what we're learning. And I recommend that your listeners check that out for more of what we're thinking about in terms of trustworthiness and emerging technologies like AI.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We're on a mission to collect examples of how you're using AI to elevate your work. Share your examples at designof.ai. This episode was hosted by Arpi Drag-Figueredo, founder and principal strategist at PH1 Research, and Brittany Hobbs, VP Insights at Huge. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. You can find it at designofai.substack.com.